Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Is It Communist? Obviously, a spin off series from Is It Fascist. I was having a lot of fun doing Is It Fascist, but I find almost as much with fascism, the term communism is just a generic term for things you disagree with. Whereas for liberals, fascist is a term for conservative things you disagree with. For conservatives, communist is a term for liberal or social democratic things that you disagree with. Even if nothing that you're calling it has anything to do with fascism or communism as a political system or an ideology, it's just used because it's a pejorative and it's scary and you don't want to be labeled a fascist or a communist. So, likewise, with Is It Fascist, I came up with 12 criteria that I think, generally speaking, apply to communist ideology, communist parties, and communist states. Now, as there's a billion different types of communism, much like there's a billion different types of fascism, I'm trying to kind of represent a generic Marxist Leninism. Obviously, there's stuff like National Communism or Stalinism or Juche or stuff like that, and they would not probably get 12 out of 12 on this. I'm not sure if necessarily any country would, but we're trying to look at it as like a pure ideology, wherein if a society was the most stereotypically communist society possible, it would hopefully meet all 12 of these. So I'm going to say this is a preliminary list. I just came up with this. If people think I'm missing anything, I should remove anything, I should change anything. The language here is not really supposed to be like negative or critical or anything like that. It's just supposed to be descriptive of things that I find to be core aspects of a communist ideology or a communist state. So for the inaugural episode, I figured since we did MAGA for fascism, let's do Putin's Russia or United Russia for the inaugural Is It Communist episode. And kind of what the impetus for even making this is I keep hearing Republican politicians and just people, conservatives in general, saying Putin's a communist, Russia's a communist state, United Russia's a communist party. They're getting the old gang back together. It's a KGB Stalinist regime and stuff like that. So I just wanted to like take a look at it and see, is Putin really a communist? Is modern Russia really a communist state? Is it really the ideological heir in all respects to the Soviet Union? Is it a Marxist paradise? As always, I don't rate these things ahead of time. I don't calculate these things ahead of time. So let's take a look at this and let's grade Russia under Putin and I guess kind of United Russia, basically just Putinism and Putin's political system in Russia, and try to determine, is it communist? Now, you'll notice as we go through this, and I'll explain why I went with these as we go, a lot of these you might recognize are very similar to Is It Fascist? Partially that's because there's overlap between the two. Like when we get to one, like totalitarianism, there's always some overlap. Fascism is a syncretic ideology that's a mix of a bunch of different things, communist and socialist thought being one of them. Also, you'll notice some of them are explicitly here to differentiate itself from fascism. I might wind up doing an is it liberal or is it conservative, and there will be probably some things from this one that make it into is it liberal, because there's always at least some overlap between ideologies. So, first, we have a revolutionary progressive ideological foundation. Now, for Is It Fascist, it was a syncretic mixture of revolutionary, progressive, and conservative reactionary ideas. Communist societies tend to be entirely progressive. And the term is vague, of course, but it's partially just a outlook towards the future, building a better man, building a better society. But on any kind of social issue, be it like women's rights, the role of the family, sexual morality, abortion, most of these things, communist states tend to be more liberal than their non-communist counterparts, or at least they were historically. Nowadays, we've kind of gotten into an interesting scenario, but the concept of social progressivism, being opposed to bourgeoisie mentality, being opposed to the traditions of the country, is a core component of most forms of communism. Now, does this describe Russia? Short answer, no. The official ideology of United Russia is conservative democracy. Or, sorry, Russian conservatism or sovereign democracy. United Russia and kind of Putinism in general is what I like to call a big tent of the right, wherein Putin took all the different right wing movements within Russia and more or less fused them into one large party. Within United Russia, you'll have nationalists, you'll have social religious conservatives, but you'll also have like liberal conservatives, some classical liberals, all kinds of different stuff. Basically, anyone to the slightly on the right of the political spectrum, and even I guess some people who are kind of centrist or radical centrists, are part of United Russia. Generally speaking, it advocates, or Putin advocates, a mixed economy with a lot of state intervention, but also a lot of liberal economic policies. I believe Russia has a fairly low tax rate, and they tend to be very, I guess you could say, fiscally conservative when it comes to like balancing the budget and debt levels. Particularly when Putin came to power, there's a book I read called Putinomics, and they dramatically reduced Russia's debt levels. So you have those different aspects. In terms of social policies, Russia is a pretty conservative country. It generally speaking, even if it's only kind of cynical, the Orthodox Church is more or less the de facto state religion, and they tend to take fairly conservative positions on stuff like the definition of marriage between a man and a woman, gender roles within the family. They haven't banned women from things, but it's definitely feels like it's headed more in that direction than it was under the Soviet Union. Also, a promotion of traditional Russian culture and Russian identity is something that has emerged. Now, granted, I think what people tend to get confused about is Putin's Russia has maintained a lot of symbols or aesthetics from the Soviet Union. You still have the same national anthem, although they replaced the lyrics to it. And you'll have some of the same names for things. You'll have some regiments will have their old Soviet regalia. But I don't think that's necessarily a sign that it's communist. It's a sign that, if anything, I kind of view Soviet nostalgia as kind of a form of romantic nationalism. The example or the comparison I would kind of give is if someone was a legitimist, but they still had fondness towards Napoleon. Napoleon might represent everything they hate, but it was the time when France was the strongest and when France made the world shake. The Soviet Union is an integral part of Russian history, and it's arguably when they were the strongest. And so there's definitely going to be some nostalgia for it, and they're not going to pretend that that part of history didn't exist. That being said, a lot of things have also gotten czarist or imperial era Russian symbols. They've renamed a lot of things to czarist era stuff. So I don't think in any meaningful sense you can say it's primarily a revolutionary or progressive ideology that governs Russia. There was, I think, it was prior to maybe at least the Georgia War, but maybe also the Euromaidan. It was a bit more liberal and a bit more Western aligned. And I think there was more of a desire to kind of integrate Russia into the Atlantic system or at least have cordial relations with the EU and the United States. That, I think, more or less collapsed post Georgia, and things have just kind of been getting worse. So I do think Russia has probably been getting more conservative or reactionary, whatever you want to call it, over time. But it's most definitely not a progressive or like revolutionary society. If anything, a lot of it is kind of a return to like pre-Soviet Russian conservatism and pre-Soviet Russian liberalism. So it gets a 0% there. Number two, rejection of a market economy and or private property. I kind of have to have this because it is communism. That's kind of the entire basis of it. These things are kind of the same thing. I don't know if you can really have I guess you can maybe have a market economy without a private property, or private property without a market economy. But these are kind of like the two key aspects of having full communism: is central planning and no, the abolition of private property. Now, some communists will try to like have some sleight of hand. They'll say, well, there's not private property, there's personal property. But generally speaking, everything in society of any value is collectively owned or owned by the state as a proxy for collective ownership. Now, the question is Russia a planned economy? No, Russia is not a planned economy. Does Russia lack private property? No. I mean, you could argue that, and this is where we get into the issue. If a society is corrupt and the government does steal or extort from the people, does that mean that it's a rejection of private property, or is it that there is private property rights, they just aren't adequately enforced? And I would tend towards the latter, because in societies that have private property, there's always exceptions to it, like eminent domain or just taxation or something like that. And I think Russia, generally speaking, does have private property rights. You just have a lot of corruption, sometimes arbitrary seizures of stuff. You had the oligarchs that stole a bunch from the country. But I don't think that that's an ideological thing. I think that's just corruption. That's just a disorder within the society rather than, it's a bug rather than a feature. As far as the market economy goes, from my understanding, Russia has a market economy. It has more state intervention than some countries and less state intervention than others. Unless we're going to say that any sort of a country that is any kind of state-owned enterprise or any kind of interventionism in the economy is necessarily centrally planned or socialist, I'm going to have to say no. Russia is a country that has a market economy and or private property. The fact that it's exceedingly corrupt and there's more state intervention than some other countries is kind of irrelevant. A belief that people are primarily separated by socioeconomic class rather than other factors, be they cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. So obviously, this is a mirror image of fascism, and this is one of the big distinctions. Part of fascism is class collaboration. That is, the Italian capitalist and the Italian worker have more in common than the Chinese worker and the Italian worker. In communism, it's the opposite. It's workers of the world unite. It's the cleavages within society are between different socioeconomic classes. And in fact, a lot of the other things, be they cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial, are things that are invented by the bourgeoisie to try to keep the people in line. Now, is this the case in modern Russia? Does the Putin regime believe that socioeconomic class is primarily what separates people in different countries? Would they say that the American worker and American and Russian worker have more in common than the Russian worker and the Russian capitalist? I'm going to say a big no on this one. Now, you can argue that the type of nationalism that is promoted by Putin United Russia is more cultural than purely ethnic. The point is that there is some conception of Russian identity, that Russia is a unique country, is a unique people, and they will at least rhetorically pander to this. Now, people will say, well, they're accepting a lot of immigrants from Central Asia, or they do make certain provisions or autonomy agreements or culturally protect minorities like the Chechens or Tatars or something. But the state is like 85% ethnic Russian. It is by the Russians, for the Russians, and there are appeals to traditional Russian culture. Once again, the Orthodox Church is the de facto state religion, and there is a conception of Slavic identity. This has been particularly appealed to a lot during the war with Ukraine, wherein they will say they are, whereas Ukrainians are viewed as, by some people, and Putin said stuff like this too, as being fellow Slavs, fellow East Slavs, fellow Russians, even fellow Orthodox. And so I don't think class struggle really plays much of a role in modern Russia's political ideology at all. they will talk about colonialism and oppression and stuff like that, and they'll talk about the global financial elite. But the third worldism Russia espouses, I think, is more kind of political in the sense that it's at least theoretically advocating, even if it's deeply cynical, national self determination and less political control of third world countries. But I don't think it's primarily economic the way it was during the Soviet period. So that's going to be another zero. A belief in dialectical materialism or the idea that history is inevitably moving towards communism. Now, I might be misunderstanding what dialectical materialism is. My understanding, though, is that Marx took Hegelian dialectics and felt that the inevitable progress of the historical narrative is towards communism, that communism and socialism would inevitably come about out of the failings of capitalism, that capitalism would collapse, you'd have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and then the dictatorship of the proletariat, and you'd eventually come to a communist society. Even within the context of modern China, the Communist Party likes to say that, oh, we're going to industrialize the country under capitalism, and then we're eventually going to go back to being a socialist society. We're just kind of slowing down and taking a step back on the historical dialectic. Now, has anything Putin said in any way resembled this? I guess once again, if we want to say like the third worldism, that is the decline in the power of the Atlantic system, the decline of the power of the West, the emergence of the BRICS. If we want to say that that's dialectical materialism, I think that's a bit of a stretch. Once again, I think that's more of like a power politics thing and a um, pandering to national self determination than it is any sort of belief in uh, any sort of economic doctrine. Once again, Russia is not a socialist or communist state. It is a kleptocracy. It has state capitalism, but it's not a planned economy. So I'm going to have to give it a zero here. I can't really remember Putin ever talking about that. A belief in the supremacy of the party or state. Now they're going to get a point here. This is something that you get under both fascism and communism. It's one of the two kind of overlapping areas. It's why you have something like 1984, where you have Big Brother and the party, because this is something you have under both. A core component of basically Russian political ideology going back to the foundation of Russia is the supremacy of the state. The Tsar was a patrimonial ruler in that all of society was basically his personal property. Absolutism, a bureaucratic government, limiting the power of regional governors, basically just a highly centralized, autocratic political system has always been the hallmark of Russia. I need to look into it more. The Soviet Union might have actually been the most decentralized Russia's ever been. But Putin has constructed a exceedingly centralized political system, emphasizing direct loyalty to the state. You have multiple parties, but it's basically a de facto one party system. I think that the other parties exist in part so that like ideas can be discussed. So like um, the far right party might bring up some things that might not be kind of simpatico within United Russia, or the left wing parties might bring that up. And it kind of gives it a forum for discussion of different ideas, for different types of opinions to be expressed. And some of these might be incorporated into United Russia's platform. But so there is some concessions to political pluralism. By and large, though, Putinism is very statist. It's very much about conflating the Russian nation with the Russian state, and the conflation of the United Russia Party with the Russian state. So yes, it does get a point in this area. And this is, I think, why I think people don't get is they assume all non-democratic, however you want to define democracy, which is a very vague term, forms of government are the same, that fascism, communism, or what's often known as authoritarian conservatism, something along the lines of what Franco or Salazar or DM maybe, or even you could argue the KMT under Chiang Kai shek, um, something like that. Like Horthy's regime in Hungary is sometimes referred to as being fascist, even though it was more conservative in nature and lacked a lot of the radical aspects that you see within actual fascist countries. In fact, Horthy was eventually overthrown in a fascist coup because his government tried to surrender to the Soviets and because it was too moderate in general. So, once again, the fact that a society tends to be somewhat authoritarian doesn't mean it's communist or fascist. A conception of an idealized new socialist man who has no spiritual purpose. I'm not sure if no higher spiritual purpose would be correct here, but much as with fascism, there is a dominant thing. You have the new Soviet man. The idea is like the new socialist man is someone who's freed from the traditional constraints of bourgeoisie morality. That is, he's no longer tied to his class, to his nation, to his religion. He's someone who selflessly sacrifices and works for the collective good. There is very much a belief that we can change human nature fundamentally through education or propaganda or something like that to create this new socialist man, to create a completely new society. Within communism, there is a belief that human nature is perfectible, that with enough time, enough effort, and enough, I don't know if you want to call it influence or manipulation, you can create this new man. Now, is this the case in modern Russia? I would say no. Once again, I do think it does have a conception of a man. If anything, though, it would be more like the fascist one. But I think it's more just kind of a traditional, like, chauvinistic Russian masculinity that's promoted by the state, as kind of epitomized by Russia, like that a Russian man like cares for his family, that he fights for his country, that he's a patriot, stuff like that, than any sort of like new socialist male. Also, once again, modern Russia, at least rhetorically, is to a certain extent a confessional state. The Constitution references God, the national anthem references God. Um, I think, and this, because I couldn't really figure out another place to put this, but no spiritual purpose, meaning that he can attain perfect happiness on earth, that there isn't a God or a heaven he's trying to reach, that the true socialist man lives entirely in the here and now. So I don't think that in any way describes modern Russia, so it's going to get a zero there. An ideologically driven foreign policy that emphasizes the need for global revolution and solidarity with other socialist countries. Now, someone argued that I was talking to that this is not the right term, that global revolution means the construction of a global social republic. My understanding is it's an attempt to export the revolution by supporting communist parties in other countries, that is, funding them, providing them with weapons. The idea is to spread communism to other parts of the world, and that the ideology is not particularly pragmatic, but is more focused on ideological purity. That is, you don't necessarily you try to avoid making deals with pinko communists or with social democrats, and the idea is to try to, as much as possible, push other countries towards socialism. Now, sometimes you'll have to take like Arab socialists or India or Gandhian socialists or something and try to work with them, even though they're somewhat ideologically distinct. But it's very much a ideologically driven foreign policy that stresses the fraternal brotherhood of socialist countries. Now, we can argue that to a certain extent, Russia has something like this with the Third Worldism, but that's not necessarily, I would say, an economic thing. That's more of a cultural thing. That's like a cultural, political thing. It's not particularly, I guess, like when we talk about the global south, it particularly with the expansion of BRICS, it includes Saudi Arabia, which is a developed country. It's going to include, I believe, Argentina, which is also a developed country. Well, depending on your definition of a developed country, Argentina is an economic basket case, but that's a topic for another time. It does contain most of it is newly emergent or newly industrialized countries. This is true, but I think BRICS is more as it's the point of BRICS and the point of Russian foreign policy is more to create a counterbalance to the Atlantic system and to institutions they view as being dominated by the US and its allies rather than any particular ideological agreement. I think if you look at it, there isn't necessarily anything ideologically that binds the BRICS together beyond an opposition to the world order that was created by the United States after World War II, and in particular after the end of the Cold War. It is kind of a cynical, just us kind of banding together against a common enemy. And I think to a certain extent that is a feature, not a bug, that they don't prescribe a particular economic or ideological system for their countries, but they tend to just be like, to each his own. Like, if Russia wants to be an orthodox conservative state, that's fine. If Brazil wants to be more socialist and liberal, then that's fine. It's up to each country to kind of just deal with that stuff on their own. We're more concerned with international relations than the internal politics of countries. So in that regard, I'm going to have to say no. Although you can maybe make an argument here that they tend to support. You know what? I'm going to give them half a point here just to be kind of Iron Man the viewpoint because they do support anti-Western, anti-American revolutions, if only kind of in passing. So we're going to give half a point here just in the sake of fairness. Number eight, a primary focus on economics over other issues. Now, this is the mirror image of fascism. Fascism is very much unconcerned with economics. The idea is through spiritual mobilization, through the force of will, or whatever equivalent, you're able to obtain um, victory. You're able to make the trains run on time, so long as there is an adequate moral and spiritual union amongst the nation. Economics will just kind of work itself out. Now, someone might point out that this would also apply to libertarianism, in which I'd say yes, they share kind of a very often materialistic, economically focused view of the world. So that is an area of overlap between the two ideologies. Now, is Russia primarily focused on economics over other issues? I mean, Russia certainly has a fairly strong focus on economics, but if you look at like campaigns Russia has had over since Putin took power, crime's fallen, the abortion rate's fallen a lot. Um, they've attempted to address things like alcoholism, largely unsuccessfully. But you had, I think, alone the fact that they decided to do the war in Georgia and to do the war in Ukraine, despite the fact that it has resulted in massive sanctions from the West, indicates that economics is not their sole concern. It's not their primary concern. Nobody knew that like things would work out as well as they did when Russia went to war with Ukraine and in the West completely blockaded them. A lot of people, myself included, thought the economy was going to collapse. And while there is a strong economic component to it, it's not to the extent that I think is really meant by this. It's not like China economy strong. It's not a planned economy. Number nine, the view that the rejection of Marxist principles stems from propaganda, false consciousness, or mental illness. Now, this one might kind of sound like a pejorative, but generally speaking, because communism purports to be a scientific ideology and the inevitable result of a capitalist society, it does have to kind of resort to something like this. And you can see this with modern forms of leftism that are not communist but take some inspiration from it. The idea is you have false consciousness that the bourgeoisie have used religion or culture or race or something like that and they've invented these things as a way to prevent you from recognizing your social class, from recognizing the truth that society is divided based on economics and not these other things. In the Soviet period, you had something called sluggish schizophrenia, wherein people who disagreed with communist ideology were diagnosed as being mentally ill, and they used abusive psychiatry as a way to deal with it. We also do see that today with modern forms of leftism, whereas everything is a phobia. It's not that you're anti-gay; it's that you're homophobic. You have a pathological fear of gays. You have a pathological fear of Muslims, etc. It's not a difference of opinion. It's an active mental illness, or it's something that was programmed into you. Now, is this the case with Russia? Well, Russia's not a Marxist country, so I don't really think that this would apply. You could argue that they say like a rejection of our narrative comes from propaganda or false consciousness, and they'll say that that's probably common in the West among the average Westerner that they're ruled by elites who don't share their values. But I don't think Russia has really said like, oh, the idea of France being a country is a lie invented by the bourgeoisie, or like Islam is a lie invented by the bourgeoisie to control the like Islam, the Arab working class. I've never heard anything like that. They will talk about like the bankers, sometimes, or global finance or global corporations trying to control people. But I mean, Trump talks about that. Is Trump a communist? Lots of people complain about oligarchs. Lots of people complain about kleptocrats. There's not anything particularly Marxist within um, what they refer to as being propaganda. Okay, encouragement of mass political action, often in the form of a political party or other organization. So I'm going to give a point here because Russia is basically a one party state. Now, why I haven't done a is it fascist for Russia yet is I need to look into a bit more how much political participation is actually encouraged. So, like within communist states, oftentimes you're encouraged to join your party. You're encouraged to take part in patriotic things, party events, party organizations. Like if there's a youth league, you're encouraged to join that. You're encouraged to be part of a committee. If there's like a communist party committee at your work, to show up for things. These things are generally viewed as being meritorious, and it does provide a area for political participation, wherein you can go to your theoretically at least your local communist party meeting and express your concerns or your grievances or whatever, and hopefully they will be listened to. Or you can within your local organization get elected a chair or eventually kind of work your way up in the party. There is that outlet for political thought. Now, particularly during the Stalinist or Maoist era, you have people are encouraged to report on each other. Maoism takes this to its logical extreme, where they just had literally militias who would go around and beat people up who weren't on board enough with the political program. But as far as I could determine, I think this is the case in Russia. But Russia, like I said, is kind of a conservative authoritarian government. And generally speaking, those forms of government don't really like political participation. They're kind of more happy with just people doing what they're told. But beyond that, they're not particularly interested in um, constant political programs or stuff like that. Probably because they tend to be conservative rather than revolutionary by temperament. So I'll give it a point here, but I'm not entirely sure how true that is. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite intergroup to safeguard the revolution. So if this was is it fascist and it was the new order or the revolution, then yes, this would certainly be a case. Russia's more or less become a presidential dictatorship under the rule of Putin, who wields near absolute power. And he also has his circle of close advisors around him: Medvedev, what's his name? I forget what the Minister of Defense's name is, but he has this cabal of leaders and technocrats and government officials who control the state. So yes, there is a elite vanguard that governs society. It doesn't appear in exactly the same way as it does in some other societies, but there is a political party whose purpose is to ensure order and to protect the current political system. Now, once again, it's not a revolutionary government, though. It's a conservative government. It's a conservative authoritarian government with some liberal characteristics. It's not like they implemented radical socialism or anything like that. But there is definitely a vanguard of sorts who's there to ensure that Putinism continues and to deal with any kind of dissent. There is a deep, I think people have to understand, and I think people who don't understand Russia don't really keep in mind the concept of what the 1990s were like. When the Soviet Union collapsed, crime was out of control, oligarchs were going crazy, the regional governors were just doing whatever they wanted, the mafia, corruption as bad as it is now was incomparably worse during the 90s. And people were generally speaking very happy when Putin took control and just cracked down on it. Crime has gone down. The oligarchs are less powerful than they used to be. Russia is a much more stable place now than it was previously. So, to a lot of people who remember the 90s, if Russia is a little bit authoritarian now, that's preferable to it being an anarchic kleptocracy the way it was during the 90s. And finally, a total rejection of religion and the supernatural, resulting in total secularism or state atheism. However, in some cases, one religion may be repressed less than others, because you'll have atheist regimes, state atheism, like in Vietnam, but Buddhism has faces a lot less discrimination than the other religions, and stuff like that. Now, this would, in the case of, say, Islamic communism, actually uh, lose a point. So, like the communist regime you had in Afghanistan and in Somalia, even if it was on paper theoretically secular, it was still Islamic. Islam was still, even if they wasn't officially the state religion, it was de facto the state religion. There wasn't really any attempt to crack down on people practicing Islam. It wasn't like how we would understand it. Total secularism, I'm referring to as like the complete banning of religion from the public sphere altogether. People are still allowed to practice it in private, but you can't have religious schools. You can't have any religious symbolism in government. You can't have people making appeals to God in government. Um, in state atheism, it's there's an active campaign to destroy religion in all of its forms. Kids are taught that religions are fake in school and that kind of thing. Now, is this the case in modern Russia? No. They revised their constitution to put God in their constitution. Um, Putin references Putin's orthodox, whether or not you want to believe that he is sincere in his orthodox views or it's completely a cynical power grab. The point is that a lot of the leadership of Russia today are outwardly Orthodox Christians. Orthodoxy enjoys a position as a de facto state religion. Whether or not that this is a cynical political move is kind of irrelevant. In no way is modern Russia a state atheist country. It's just not. Um, Keep in mind that countries can repress other religions, and that doesn't, under this definition, make them a state atheist. Like if they're an Islamic state that kills Christians and Jews and stuff, that doesn't make them secular, but it just makes them kind of intolerant. So let us go through and see how many points we have. So we have 10 to 12, as with fascism, that is communist. And then 8 to 9, I went with goulash communism. I could come up with radical socialist if we wanted to appeal to like Hearts of Iron, or sorry, Kaiserreich or something like that. But goulash communism is the term that they had for the communism in Hungary, which was the most liberal and kind of laid back of the Eastern Bloc states. There was some aspects of a market economy. There was some aspects of free expression. There was more private property rights and more kind of intellectual property rights and stuff like that. It was called goulash communism because goulash is kind of a stew that has a bunch of different stuff thrown in. So I just thought that's a funny term, and if people want, I can use something else for it. So Putin and United Russia get 2.5 out of 12. So it is not even vaguely close to being a communist state. If we were to do is it fascist, then it would probably might be in the parafascist category. But there's like nothing about modern Russia that is a communist state. Aside from it being statist and somewhat authoritarian and basically being a one party state. But the ideological content of a communist state, the idea that it's a communist state is frankly kind of retarded. Um, it comes from like this perspective that nothing's changed in the last 30 years, that Russia is exactly the same as it was since 1990, and there's been no cultural or political changes in the time period, and that's very clearly not the case in a lot of different ways. Like I said, it's a mixture of Russian conservative authoritarianism with some liberal aspects to it, and some other stuff, but it's really not meaningfully communist aside from some of the aesthetics and iconography and like the national anthem and the names of certain things. But like once again, that's more of a continuity thing, and that's viewing the Soviet Union as a period in Russian history. Although, ironically, the purpose of the Soviet Union was to a large extent to repress great Russian nationalism and identity in favor of affirmative action for the minority populations. But that's a conversation for another time. There's also the like gotcha that like, oh, Putin was a member of the Communist Party. He was part of the KGB. It's like, well, it was a one party state. So literally everybody who was in a government official was a member of the Communist Party. Like that's just how one party states work. It's like in Iraq where they fired all civil servants who were members of the Ba'ath Party. I'm like, well, you had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party. It doesn't necessitate like a total 100% commitment to the ideals. It's if you wanted any role in society, you had to join the one party. It's very anachronistic. It's very stupid. It's very much not acknowledging just basic common sense. I know in Germany they did this too. They're like, we have to denazify it, so we have to fire everybody who was a member of the Nazi party. And I'm pretty sure to get a civil service job, you had to be a member of the Nazi party. I could be wrong about that, but it was certainly like a critical aspect of the bureaucracy. So the idea that like Russia's a communist state because Putin was a member of the Communist Party 30 years ago when Russia was a one party state is just retarded. Like that's just not that doesn't make any sense. That's just not the way that it works. So Russia's not a communist state. It's not goulash communism. It's not anywhere close. It's an authoritarian conservative government that has aspects of state capitalism and the free market to it. Um, but it's definitely not communist. So I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless everybody. Let me know what you think about this down in the comments. What I should change, if anything, and I'll talk to you guys all real soon.